Hey, what's up? Don Vickers here. Thank you so much for stopping by. Today I'm going to be reviewing Hermann Ebbinghaus' life, research, and contribution to psychology. My name is Don Michael Vickers. Hermann Ebbinghaus was born in 1850 in Barmen, Germany. Ebbinghaus was the son of a rich merchant, Karl Ebbinghaus. He studied history and philosophy at the age of 17 at the University of Bonn and received a PhD in philosophy in 1973. Got an interesting quote here. Psychology has a long past, yet its real history is short. So what he's referring to here is when you think back to psychology, it has a really long history in terms of philosophy, where it's rooted. People like Aristotle, Socrates. However, he really believes that the true history of psychology begins with Wundt, Fechner, Herbert, the people who took an empirical look at psychology. So he helped establish the Journal for the Psychology and Physiology of the Sense Organs and worked as the editor for 22 years. One interesting fact I didn't know about before I studied him, in 1885 he had a son, Julius Ebbinghaus, who became a well-known neo-Kantian philosopher, so he studied under Immanuel Kant. And in 1897 he wrote a psychology textbook which was used for many, many years afterwards. In addition to memory studies, Ebbinghaus made a major contribution to psychology with sentence completion exercises. And he wrote on Fechner's psychophysics as well and developed a theory on color perception. In 1893, he took a professorship at Breslau University. Ebbinghaus believed that memory could be studied experimentally and began conducting experiments with himself as the subject. So he's really inspired by Fechner, and he saw, look at what he did, and thought, hey, I can do this with memory, and that's what inspired him. He died of pneumonia in 1909. So as I mentioned earlier, with Wundt opening up the Institute for Experimental Psychology in 1879 at the University of Leipzig, this had a major impact on psychology at the time. Wundt also used metronomes in his experiments a lot, and in Ebbinghaus nonsense syllable experiments, Ebbinghaus would use a metronome to recite syllables at a rate of 150 per minute. By far, though, the biggest influence on Ebbinghaus was Gustav Fechner. In 1860, Fechner released Elements of Psychophysics, and when Hermann Ebbinghaus was traveling in Paris from 1873 to 1878, it's believed somewhere in this period he came across a copy of Elements of Psychophysics, and he was incredibly impressed by the methods that Fechner was using, and he believed that he could apply that to memory. In one of his psychology textbooks, Fundamentals of Psychology, he signed the signature out to Fechner, and he said, I owe everything to you. So Ebbinghaus had some theories on forgetting. The first one being interference theory. So what I think of here is like you have an idea in your mind, and then you take a new idea and you push it to the back of your brain, interfering with that idea. The second one being a trace decay theory. So what he uses a metaphor of colors here. So when you have a new idea, it's vivid, it's bright in your mind. However, as time goes by, it tends to fade. And I think of an apple like rotting here. It starts out like bright green, bright red, but as time goes by, it begins to fade. There's an interesting quote here. All sorts of ideas, if left to themselves, are to be forgotten. Another theory was the multi-component theory of forgetting. So what I think of here is a puzzle, and you have some of the pieces, but not all the pieces. So you can't fully put the puzzle together, but you're not totally missing all the parts of the theory. So there was a study here by American psychologist Norman Slamecka in 1961. He made subjects learn either 1, 2, 3, or 4 passages of 20 words, and when asked the subject to recall the last passage after a delay of either 15, 30 minutes, 1 hour, 24 hours. And what the experiment revealed was the more passages that they had to learn, the worse they performed, and also there was a negative impact with time. So he did a study here in 1961. If you take a look here at the black triangle group, so they had to do 3 prior passages, and they performed the worst, and the group that performed the best just did 1 passage, so they didn't have any other previous. So this provides some support for Ebbinghaus interference theory. So with the more passages they had to learn, the worse they performed, and also every group performed worse over time. So a bit of evidence there for the decay theory. So for the nonsense syllable study, so this was Ebbinghaus' big study. So he used himself as his only subject. He created lists of nonsense syllable like walks, wool, and he came up with 2,300 of these. Ebbinghaus used 163 double tests, each consisting of learning 8 series of 13 syllables, though there were 38 double tests with 6 syllables each. The purpose was to analyze the impact of time on how he would forget the information. The goal was to be able to correctly recite a list twice correct with no errors, though he would later switch to once correct to save on time. He was so dedicated to his experiments that he wanted to control his own life so he could be a consistent subject and not have his life impact his results. He would later relearn these lists at a time of 20 minutes, after 1 hour, after 9 hours, after 24 hours, 2 days, 6 days, or 31 days. The big one here is going to be that 24-hour period. So each series would be read completely through from beginning to end, not in separate parts. The reading and recitation took place at 150 strikes per minute with a metronome. Ebbinghaus believed that since it was impossible to speak continuously without an accent, that this must be accounted for. What he did was at either the 1st, 4th, 7th, or the 1st, 5th, and 9th syllables, he pronounced those with a slight accent. Now, I didn't see what accent that was, but I know that he was German, so I am assuming that was a German accent. Some rules for the study. After he learned each series, he paused for 15 seconds to record the results. The goal was to learn as quickly and as feasibly as possible. He avoided using mnemonics, so like I mentioned earlier with like Wux or Wool, I'm not sure if they would be something in German, but when I hear wool, I picture sheep, and then I'd come up with wool. He tried to control life as much as possible to avoid irregularities and keep life as similar as possible. So he wanted to be physically the same as much as possible and test during the day. A note on the mnemonics here. So basically what that is it's any kind of memory aid. He did not use those. So this is the forgetting curve. You see on the left here, so that's the amount of information retained, and you want to compare that to how time impacted the study. So if you take a look at the big one there, like I mentioned, being 1 day, he's only retained 1/3 of the original information. After that, it tends to flatten out. So that's the big stage here. And I kind of thought of the Men in Black scene where Will Smith, I'm not even sure what's called, flashes his stick and wipes your memory. So 24 hours after learning, we forget 2/3 of what we learned. Some criticism. So Frederick Bartlett said that this was a highly artificial study, that this wouldn't really apply to real life. And I think that's a valid point, because when are we ever going to learn nonsense syllables? Bartlett believed that in order to have learning, you need to have meaning, and not having meaning makes it more difficult to learn. And I see his point, but the forgetting curve has been demonstrated in many future studies. John A. Glaze, who was a professor at the University of Michigan, suggested that the nonsense syllables would be too close to real words, and this could potentially be a valid criticism, because in one future replication they made sure to avoid this, which I'm going to get into in a second here. So this was one of the replications that I looked at. So they used the same time intervals as Ebbinghaus, from 20 minutes to 31 days. They used a Dutch speaker instead of German. So like Glaze mentioned there, with the syllables being too close to real words, they were really careful to avoid that. 2,100 consonant vowels instead of 2,300. And like I mentioned, Ebbinghaus had performed to be twice correct and later switched to once correct to save on time. They just went to once correct. They originally used the metronome during the training phase, but they found it too distracting. So they eliminated the metronome after training. One interesting thing they found was the primacy and recency effect. So I think back to an activity that we did in class with the Mary Whitten Calkins paired associations. During the first part of that, I noticed that the class performed a lot better with the last one and the first one, but they struggled a bit with the middle pairs. So I found this from the University of Waterloo. So essentially what this gets at here is, so let's say you have class Monday and it ends at 2:15. What you want to do is you want to review for at least 10 minutes before Tuesday at 2:15, that 24-hour period, to help, instead of being at 1/3, get you up to almost 100% retention. So spend 10 minutes prior to reaching the 24-hour period. A week later, you will only need 5 minutes to achieve the same level of retention. On day 30, you'll only need 2 to 4 minutes. Waterloo recommends studying a half hour a day. So think back to that Will Smith making us forget our memories. A half hour a day keeps the Will Smith away. And 1.5 to 2 hours every weekend, depending on your course load. Ebbinghaus summarized this concept. The schoolboy doesn't force himself to learn his vocabularies and rules altogether at night, but knows that he must impress them again in the morning. The teacher distributes his lesson not indifferently over the period at his disposal, but reserves in advance a part of it for one or more reviews. So this was a really cool study that I found. So talk about the benefit of spacing your studying out. So when he talks about the retrieval theory here, so basically what's saying is when there's a delay in the studying, when it's spaced out, your brain has to go back and retrieve that prior information, and this strengthens it. One of the other studies that he mentioned inside of this article was they had a group of grade 7 students and divided them into 2 groups, and they were tested over 9 weeks on 12 different math topics. Both groups had 12 assignments. One group would have assignments where each problem was based on one topic, and no other assignment would have questions on that topic. This is referred to as block practice. The other group would have 4 questions on the current topic and 8 questions on previous work. The other 8 would be spread across future assignments. This is space practice. And the group that did the space practice performed far greater than the ones in the block. So one guy that Ebbinghaus didn't really see eye to eye with was Wilhelm Dilthey. They kind of had it out for each other. So Dilthey would be in that psychology as a social science, and Ebbinghaus would be psychology as a natural science. Ebbinghaus being more of a quantitative kind of guy, and Dilthey being qualitative. So there was a quote here from Dilthey that I found in Dave Chacot's biography on Hermann Ebbinghaus. Dilthey said, "We explain nature, but we understand psychic life, and any psychology which was modeled after atomistic physics, as was a psychology such as Ebbinghaus, could never understand, for in the final process of understanding had to be explained and could not be inferred logically." So Ebbinghaus also did work with perception. I'm going to show you this here. Hopefully it works better than last time. So as you'll see, the orange circle on the left is surrounded by bigger circles, and the orange circle on the right is surrounded by small circles. So the orange circle tends to look bigger. I applied this last year in softball when they did the team picture by standing next to the shorter guys. So his legacy. So one of his most famous students was Wilhelm Stern, and he helped formulate the questions developed in the IQ test by Louis Terman. Ebbinghaus was invited to the 20th anniversary of the Clark University, founded by G. Stanley Hall, for experimental psychology. E.B. Titchener was particularly distraught by his passing. Ebbinghaus' contributions are still relevant today. You can purchase On Memory on Amazon 100 years after publication. And as you notice, 2 of his studies were mentioned here were 2015 and 2016.